Chapter 4, Forecasting. Forecasting is a process of predicting a future event. So in our case, we are trying to predict what demand we will have for the products that we make. So this chapter is about demand forecasting. Demand forecasting is important because it is the basis upon which all business decisions are made, whether it is production planning, inventory control, or human resource planning, or facilities planning, facilities location. All the decisions are based on what we expect our demand is going to be in the future. So demand forecasting is an important function of running a business. Forecast time horizons may vary from short range, medium range to long range. Short range forecasts are typically about 3 months to 6 months. I wouldn't go as far as 1 year, 3 months to 6 months. And these forecasts will be the basis for decisions regarding purchasing, job scheduling, workforce scheduling, job assignment, and production scheduling in general. Medium range forecasts will vary somewhere between about 6 months to a year and a half, up to 3 years, but typically up to a year and a half. And these medium range forecasts are used for sales and production planning and budgeting decisions. Long range forecasts typically will go 3 years or over, or maybe 2 years and 3 years and more. And these are used for long-term decision making, things like new product development or facility location, plant location, and that kind of decisions. Now, there are some differences and similarities. Medium and long-term forecasts typically use similar techniques, and they support major decisions of companies like plant location, product development, and so on. Whereas short-term forecasts are typically for day-to-day running of the production operation function. And they usually employ different modeling techniques than the medium and the long term. And short term, because it is for the short term, it typically tend to be more accurate than medium and long term. Now, product life cycle also will have an impact, so you have to take that into account. So during introduction and growth phase, there may be upward trends in demand. In maturity phase, there's going to be pretty level kind of demand, and decline phase, there will be a declining nature of demand. Now, there are other kinds of forecasts possible, not only demand forecasts. We could have economic forecasts that try to predict what will be the inflation rate, what will be the cost of capital, and so on. And there could be technological forecasts as to what kind of technologies are down the line, coming down the pike, because your companies depend upon adopting new technologies fast that may give competitive advantage. But our focus here in this chapter is demand forecasting. Now, there are 7 steps in forecasting. One is to determine, the first step is to determine what is the purpose for which the forecast is made. So if it is for day-to-day operations, then you have one type of forecasting. If it is for aggregate planning, you have a different kind of forecast that you need. On the other hand, if it is for long-term forecasts, then that's a different kind of forecast. So you have to first determine what is the use, what is the application of the forecast that you're trying to develop. Then you have to select the items to be forecasted. If it is short-term forecast, then you want forecast for individual items. If it is for aggregate planning and long-term planning, you want to combine items into families of items, because when you combine products into families, you will be able to increase the accuracy of forecasts. And then determine the time horizon, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Then 4 and 5 go together. You collect data to develop your forecast and analyze the data with forecasting models so you can select the best possible model. Then you make the forecast, and then when you implement the forecast, you need to validate and implement the results. Of course, no forecast is going to be 100% accurate all the time. So there are lots of factors involved, and therefore a certain level of forecasting error is inevitable, and our task is to make sure that the forecasting error is kept to a minimum. And most techniques do assume that the underlying system is stable. Okay, if there are sudden ups and downs in the demand, then no technique can give you accurate forecasts. So for the demand forecasting techniques to work reasonably well, the underlying system that generates the demand must be reasonably stable. And of course, when you combine products into families, you'll be able to increase the accuracy of the forecast and decrease the forecast error. The forecasting approaches can be very broadly classified into two groups, qualitative and quantitative. Now, qualitative is used when there is no quantitative data available. So when you have a new product, new technology and things like that, then you will not have any data to do any quantitative analysis. So you have to rely only on qualitative methods. And you can also use qualitative methods to adjust and fine-tune your quantitative forecast using the manager's intuition and manager's experience and so on. Now, quantitative methods, on the other hand, is based on actual historical demand data that you analyze using mathematical techniques. Let's look at the qualitative methods briefly. Jury of executive opinion, Delphi method, sales force composite, and market survey are the four that we will discuss briefly. First is jury of executive opinion, where you gather together a small group of high-level experts and managers, and then they discuss all the relevant issues, work together and come up with a forecast. And they may use, if it is a product for which there is past data available, you could use statistical models to develop a forecast that you take as your input and then fine-tune it. And it is relatively quick, but there is a problem in terms of group think, especially if the organization is pretty hierarchically structured and rigid structure. There may be a built-in incentive for agreeing with the superiors in the organization. A Delphi method is different. It is an iterative approach where you have steps. You start with administrative survey of people who have knowledge about the system. They give responses, and the decision makers take those responses and come up with a forecast, which may not agree with all the forecasts. So there may be 2 or 3 or 4 different outcomes. So you then take those outcomes and feed it back to the respondents. The respondents look at those responses and then they fine-tune their previous responses, and you go through this iterative process until a consensus is evolved in terms of what the demand forecast is going to be in the future. Now, sales force composite is to ask your sales representatives to give their estimate of what the demand is going to be in the future. And the basis is that, after all, salespeople are the ones who have contact with the customers. One of the problems with this approach is that the salespeople tend to be overly optimistic, so the forecast may tend to overestimate the actual demand. Market survey is to ask the customers about their purchasing plan, send out a questionnaire and gather data from them and then aggregate that. And this will work if you have a fairly small customer base, okay, maybe 50, 60, 100. But if you have large customer base, thousands or even hundreds of thousands, reaching millions of customers, then you have to rely on statistical sampling. And when you rely on statistical sampling, you have to do statistical analysis. So it becomes time consuming, expensive, and requiring of statistical knowledge. So these are the qualitative approaches. In the next video, we'll look at the quantitative approaches.